Hi, I'm Linda Mao, and welcome to Art This Week Bio's Valley House Gallery. Here we present the full interview we did with Gallery President Kevin Vogel about the history of Valley House Gallery and Sculpture Garden. In this episode, we speak with Kevin about his father Donald, who started the gallery, the origins of the gallery in the mid-1950s, and some of the important early exhibitions. Now for our interview with Kevin. So prior to your father first opening the gallery with Betty McLean, what connections to the DFW art scene did he have?
Well, he came to Dallas in 1942 with the idea of, because he was primarily a painter, he came to sort of open up a new chapter in his life, really. He'd been in Chicago, he was tired of Chicago, and he wanted to go to a place that he thought he could be part of what was happening in the art scene. And Dallas, being fairly young in the arts at that time, as far as the development and where they were, this gave him an opportunity to be part of the scene, so to speak, and contribute in some way. So he came in '42, and during that time frame, he integrated himself as best as possible into the Dallas art scene. He actually worked for a period of time at the Dallas Little Theater, which was actually quite famous at the time, and he worked putting sets together. He often told me that he would have a budget of $5 to put a set together, and somehow managed. Every once in a while, I think he actually walked on stage. But met my mother in Fort Worth because he was very involved with the Fort Worth artists. The Dallas artists at the time he didn't really have much communication with, didn't get along with them, frankly, because his view was more international in scope, and the Dallas group had really switched more into a regionalist mode. And he really wasn't interested in that. And the Fort Worth artists were far more open and more interested in what was going on in the world, in Europe, in New York. And so he integrated himself more. Even though he lived in Dallas, he really integrated himself with the Fort Worth artists, and ended up meeting my mother in Fort Worth, actually, at the Dixon Reader House and School. And they lived on a property over near, I guess, Lover's Lane, and where Exchange Park is today. That's where Frito-Lay originally moved in. And he was a painter and had always been a painter. Consequently, that's how he was making his living. He tried to help other artists out by doing shows in places like the theaters downtown. The Majestic Theater had a mezzanine, and the Telenews Theater had a mezzanine, and he would use those to help promote other artists. And I guess they were, I guess they were married about 1950. No, I guess 47, 48 in that time frame. And my brother arrived in 1950, and that's essentially what he had been doing up until the time he worked with Betty McLean, opening up the Betty McLean Gallery.
What did he learn from his time with the Betty McLean Gallery, and how did it affect his experience with the Valley House Gallery?
Well, actually, that experience was amazing in that because Betty McLean had extraordinary contacts during that time frame, because she essentially was involved with the art world pretty much her entire life. And she knew a lot of the people in New York, the dealers in New York, and she knew a lot of the dealers and people very involved in the art world in Europe. And friends of hers were essentially the people who inherited the Vollard estate. Ambrose Vollard was a dealer in France, and he was the dealer for Picasso, dealer for Brock. He also was very involved, along with Cornweiler, in dealing with those people, but he also dealt in the French Impressionists. So anything from French Impressionism up through the moderns in the Paris moderns, basically getting into the school of Paris. Those artists were involved with the Vollard estate, and because of that, it opened up the door to that estate. In fact, later on, it allowed Valley House, the sort of evolution of the Betty McLean Gallery. It allowed Valley House access into this estate to get works that other dealers did not have access to. And in actuality, it wasn't that they didn't have access, it was more that he didn't have to actually buy the work. The work, he could actually get it on consignment. And that was huge, because he was able to put amazing exhibitions because of that, together because of that. The other thing that it did is, in that time frame, New York desperately wanted to make inroads into the Dallas art scene, and Texas art scene for that matter. So they were very interested in helping a gallery out any way they could by supplying major works, helping my father and mother put exhibitions together that would will actually be sort of landmark shows in those early years. The gallery, the start of the gallery actually is kind of unusual in that my father and mother had just had a new child, 1950, and that was my brother Eric, who is 5 years older than I am. And they had invited Betty over to see the new baby. And Betty came in, and she had a friend with her, and the friends, when they came to visit, they were oohing and aahing over the new child, of course, and in the conversation that ensued, Betty was talking about maybe doing something, opening up a business, maybe a boutique for ladies or something in that direction. And at least the way my father tells the story is that he looked at Betty, who he knew was very involved in the art world, and said, "Betty, what Dallas needs is a first-rate modern art gallery." And she basically said, "I think you're absolutely right, let's do it." So Betty was the money behind the gallery, and my father was the director of the gallery, and my mother actually worked as an assistant to Betty, sort of as a secretary. And so that's how the gallery got started. The question of why they chose the location of the gallery, it was because they had actually done some research, is my understanding, and that was very rare for my father getting involved in something like that. It's probably something that Betty's husband probably recommended they do, because he was in oil and real estate and knew the ropes in that direction. So they found out that there were more millionaires per square mile in that particular area of far north Dallas than just about anywhere else in the world at that point, or at least in this part of Texas. And consequently, they decided that that would be a good place. And that was at the edge of Dallas at the time. There was Northwest Highway had gone in, a new shopping center had gone in, which was called Preston Center, essentially. And they became the second business in Preston Center after the cafeteria was in. Because they were located in sort of the major developments that were going in around Preston Hollow and developments like that, they wanted to be where the people who could afford art would end up. And Highland Park south of them, and what was developing north, it just made sense to be in that location. They did some amazing shows in that time frame. That's like a 4-year period. 3.5 years, I guess. And they had shows by Ben Nicholson, Lionel Feininger. They had shows by Morris Graves. They had a full Calder show, including mobiles, stabiles, prints, drawings, and group shows of modern masters. And it was an amazing time for a gallery like that.
With the closing of that Betty McLean Gallery in Preston Center, did he have reservations about opening another gallery, and why so far north?
Well, the so far north question is probably what I need to answer first. He had the property on Lover's Lane, or just off of Lover's Lane, and other people wanted that property badly. And he was thinking about doing what Valley House is today. He had hoped to do in that location, which was much further into town, much easier to get to for people. And basically what it boiled down to, they made him an offer he couldn't refuse. And because of that, this is going to be 53, so the Betty McLean Gallery has another year of operation, even though he comes out to where Valley House is now. And he and my mother drive down a little bumpy two-lane country road, basically, blacktop, which is Hillcrest, and then they get on essentially a caliche road, which is Spring Valley at the time, which dead-ended. So it wasn't a through street at the time. And they found this piece of property, and the piece of property was solidly wooded, and the thing that stopped them was a picnic table. So in actuality, the reason Valley House is here is because of a picnic table that happened to be on the side of the road, totally surrounded by woods, and they thought, what a beautiful space. And they got out and walked all the way through the property to the creek, and on the way back to the Spring Valley itself, there was a lady who owned the property who had come down. There's a farm on the other side of the road, and the lady had seen my parents stop and get out and walk down, and she was very concerned because who are these people walking on my property? So she ran down and demanded to know what they were doing, and my father said, is this property for sale? And she said, for a price. And said, well, how much do you want for it? And she said, $9,500, and my father bought it on the spot, essentially. They actually closed on the property April Fool's Day 1953, and started immediately to design a what they called a frame factory at the time. At least that's on the original plans. And they always knew that they could make a living off of framing. Now, when you say so far out north, right now we're sitting in what is almost the middle of North Dallas. In actuality, at the time, I think the city limit was like Walnut Hill, which means that we're probably about 3-4 miles further out from that place. Further north. I actually have friends my age that when I asked them, did your parents ever come to Valley House? They said, oh yes. In fact, we would lock down the house like we were going away for the entire weekend, and we'd pack a picnic lunch and go out to Valley House. So for them, it was an adventure. For now, it's an easy drive, of course, but at that point, it was so far out, people thought my parents were crazy. And I would have thought they were crazy too at the time to come this far out. So the gallery, the frame shop was the first building. The second building was the residence, which is behind us at the moment, and that it was originally a 2-bedroom, 2-bath house, very 1953 modern house. It was actually unusual because the design of the house was designed by my father to sit on the foundation of a house that had burned on the property off of Lover's Lane. And what they did is they worked with an architect for the same house design, put a new foundation concept under it, and flipped it around backwards. So in other words, you're looking at the original back of the house behind us at the moment, where it turned out to be the front of the house in actuality, primarily because my father wanted a north light for his studio. And the house is built around 2 great rooms. One is his studio and the other one is just general living quarters. So that was the next building, and that became the place where exhibitions were held at the very earliest part. I was born in 55, so 53, 54 we use as the start date of Valley House Gallery. That's after the Betty McLean Gallery closes, and they close, I guess, in September of 54. So the reason we use that as the start date for the gallery itself is I actually found some invoices for framing dated in that time frame. The logo of the unicorn actually is the only thing that was transferred from the Betty McLean Gallery to Valley House Gallery, which we still use as the logo. But it became Valley House and then eventually Valley House Gallery as a term. The frame shop was, after that time, one of the main money makers for the gallery, as well as, because there weren't that many frame shops in Dallas at that time. And my father was probably the first gallery and frame shop to really take on conservation framing later. Nobody was doing it in that time frame, unfortunately, because things have suffered because of it historically. But we took on those and adopted those concepts later on as a gallery, and we're probably the first to do that as a frame shop in the area.
So did your father ever talk about this, what the space was like early on, or any difficulties opening the gallery?
Not specifically opening the gallery. He certainly had problems as time went on, but not that. We did have a flood in 1964 that my parents had to make a really tough decision at that time whether they were going to stay or move or do something else, because literally the gallery had probably a foot of water in it at that time, and the residents had 54 inches of water in it. So it was devastating. My father and brother were able to save most of the, pretty much all the art in the gallery itself, but unfortunately he lost like 100 of his own paintings in that flood.
So it seems like the gallery was trying to show some very important work, household names now. How did they get access to those works, and did they sell?
Well, as I mentioned, the dealers in New York were very, very interested in Valley House because we were really the only gallery that was doing that sort of thing. Chapman Kelly later on started bringing major works also into the Dallas area, but really my parents were the first people, beyond the Betty McLean Gallery, of course, but when they moved here, they continued that approach. And they did some amazing shows. I mean, you go back to one of the most, I guess the first really major show they did after they moved out here was an exhibition in which they had a large Monet water lily painting. And it was here, my father had it for sale at $100,000 here and couldn't find a buyer for it. That's a lot of money at that time frame, but the painting, when it left here, went immediately to the Cleveland Museum. And I had a wonderful experience about a year ago. I went to Cleveland with an artist we represent, Cedric Huckabee, and I saw that painting in the Cleveland Museum, and it's just stunning. A quick sidebar, there's a wonderful story behind that, and obviously there's not time to tell that here. The painting itself, how it got here, and the circumstances around it. But one of the interesting sidelines is that painting happened to be a rare in that it's part of a triptych, and that particular triptych is in remarkably good condition, because when the Germans were leaving, I guess retreating out of France, the convoy that was going by Monet's studio decided to machine gun his barn with his big paintings in it. And this was one of a small group of paintings that were actually parallel to the direction the machine gun bullets were going, rather than perpendicular. And unfortunately, a lot of the Monets that people see in the Orangerie and places like that have a lot of machine gun holes in them, and most people aren't aware of that. He had an exhibition, and with that exhibition at the same time, the gardens were opened up at Valley House. And the gardens are really quite unique. We've got, at the moment, a little over 4 acres of gardens here, and they were finished in 59 with the idea of an exhibition of work by Charles Umlauf. It was a retrospective exhibition at that time and was the first major sculpture show. After that, there were shows by Bordel. There was probably the culmination of probably a good end point for at least those early days of great exhibitions was the Henri Moore show. And he had over 50 major Moors throughout the property. And that happened the year after the flood, interestingly enough. The other thing that happened that was major for the gallery is, again, because the dealers in New York were fascinated in wanting to have an association with Texas, Valley House became the first gallery in Texas to become part of the Art Dealers Association of America. And that was 1964. That was the same year as the flood, actually. But unusual that a flood happens and then we become a member of the Art Dealers Association. They formed the organization 2 years earlier, so we felt very honored to be part of that, or I should say my parents felt very honored to be part of that. I was very young at the time. There was one other exhibition, and the Wildenstein show that happened in '62, and that was a very major exhibition in that Wildenstein was one of the richest galleries in the world, and for the same reason I mentioned earlier of the galleries wanting to all come to get in a foothold in Texas, they put an amazing exhibition together, and actually it contained artists like Rembrandt and Frans Hals, old masters all the way up into the Impressionist, and all the way in American painters too, Winslow Homer, Charles Demuth, people like that. So it was a very broad-reaching exhibition and really sort of a landmark show for '62. One other exhibition that is of note during that time frame was an exhibition in which my parents were able to document the point of on period of Émile Bernard, who is a French painter. And that was another coup from that standpoint. And I think if you ask my father what was the most major thing that happened, or a show that happened, it would have been in that same time frame, actually. And that was an exhibition of paintings, works on paper by Georges Rouault. And that comprised 54 paintings, and the story behind that is really fascinating. That deserves an entire interview, frankly. I wish my father was around that you could interview him on that, because my father knew that this work existed, but really nobody else knew. Certainly the Vollard estate knew. And every time my father would write a letter, he asked about these works, and he kept being put off, saying, well, they really, they don't exist. And my father kept saying, no, they have to exist. I know they exist. And finally, one day he got the letter, and he basically was told in the first part of the letter, sit down. And he did. And he was told at that time that he was going to be sent the 54 paintings of the Rouault Passion, and that it was up to him to promote them how he felt appropriate. And he did so, and I think that he would say that was the crowning achievement of what he did as a dealer, because that group of works was astounding, and he did a very good job of introducing them to the world at that early time. Unfortunately, he didn't sell them. They ended up selling, they went back to France. He even paid the taxes on them as if they were sold so that he could keep them here an extra year. He was very concerned that he was trying to find a foundation to buy them, and he found several foundations that were willing to do it, but believe it or not, no one that was willing to accept them for the money, even though the foundation was willing to put up the money for them. So, very interesting period, very unusual things happened around that, and unfortunately, after all the work and all the promotion, as a dealer you find out sometimes it doesn't work, and in this case it didn't work. But selling art was very, very tough in that time frame here, the major pieces, because lots of people did not understand the value structure and didn't understand that $9,500 for a Picasso painting by a Golden Harlequin in that time frame was really not that much money.
Did your father ever talk about any mentors?
Not as a dealer, he really didn't. What he did talk about more were mentors as an artist, people who looked after him. Probably the person he talked most about was an artist by the name of Arthur Osver and his wife Ernestine Betzberg, and that was from his days in Chicago. They really looked after him for a period of time, and they gave him a wonderful piece of advice, and that advice was because he had asked as he was leaving, is there anything I can do to repay you all for your kindness and looking after me and taking care of me? And they said, not for us, but if you find a talent, an exceptional talent sometime in the future that you believe is a special talent and they're not going to make it without help, give them help, and that's how you can repay us. And he did that on several occasions with several artists.
Did he have any fun failure stories that occurred in the early days at Valley House? Things that he was able to look back on and laugh at later?
Well, I'm not sure he would laugh at the, at the failures. I think the biggest issue with him was when he brought the Henri Moore show in, he did it only because he was told by a group of Dallas people that they would buy a piece. Because the expense of bringing a show of Henri Moore in after the flood, trying to get back on his feet, trying to get things moving again, and a sideline to that is, what I will say is that when we had the flood, the reason we really, I say we, my parents really stayed was because of the support the Dallas people gave him. I mean, the people, there was a flood sale that the people, friends of Valley House, I guess you could say, put together to make sure that they made it, essentially. And the funny thing is right after that, there was a group of Dallas people who said, we will buy Henri Moore sculptures. We will help you out in this because we know he's an important sculptor and we would like to own one of his pieces. Well, my father brought 50 pieces in, and literally at the end of the day, he only sold one piece. And every single one of the people who had said they were going to buy one ultimately did not. And I don't think he would look back at that and smile. I think that more than anything else, he probably thought was tragic because, of course, those artworks did not stay in Dallas. And he often, I mean, he actually would give up a commission sometimes to be sure that an artwork stayed in the community. He was very much for the art scene in Dallas, the Dallas Museum, even though he was often at loggerheads with the director of the museum. It seems that he's often at loggerheads with the director at the Dallas Museum over and over. He loved the people who worked there. Some of them were some of his best friends, but it had to do with, for some reason, there was this thing going on all the time. But he would often stand aside and say, it's more important that this piece come into Dallas than me making a commission on it. So he did everything he could to help promote the arts in Dallas, often quietly through the back door, even though the museum thought he wasn't helping and promoting in that sense. In actuality, I often heard him talk to clients and new collectors and say, please get involved with the museum, please support the museum, because that is your conduit to looking at art and getting associated and integrated with it. So he was always a big supporter of the museum, even though he didn't necessarily get along with the directors.
We want to thank Kevin for speaking with us. You can find more information on the gallery at valleyhouse.com. Watch for other episodes about Valley House Gallery and Sculpture Garden over the next few weeks. That's it for Art This Week Bios. Thanks for watching.
I still got your Polaroid.